The day my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm ashamed of your poor background." Something inside my chest went still. Not anger, not even surprise. Just a heavy silence I couldn't shake. I stood there in my own son's home, holding a paper bag with groceries I had paid for myself, and realized they had already decided who I was. And no matter what I said, or how much I gave, in their eyes, I was just a burden they had to tolerate. I remember the way the kitchen smelled that afternoon. Lemon cleaner and something burnt. Emily stood by the island, arms crossed, nails tapping the marble like she had all the time in the world to judge me. My son Daniel didn't say a word. He just stared at his phone, like if he stayed quiet long enough, the moment would pass without him having to choose a side. I set the groceries down gently. Bread, milk, a few things I knew they liked. Habit, I suppose. Old men like me hold on to habits, even when they stop being welcome. "I didn't mean to offend you," I said, keeping my voice even. "I just thought I'd help out a little." Emily let out a short laugh. Not loud, just sharp enough to cut. "We don't need help like that. It's embarrassing." Embarrassing. That word stayed with me. Daniel finally looked up then, but not at me. At her, like he was checking if he should agree. "You could have called first, Dad," he muttered. I nodded slowly. I didn't want to be a bother. There it was again. That silence. Heavy. Settled. Final. I stayed for another 10 minutes. 10 long minutes of sitting on the edge of their expensive sofa, hands folded, listening to them talk around me like I wasn't part of the room. Emily mentioned dinner plans, a place I couldn't pronounce. Daniel laughed at something on his phone. No one asked me to stay. No one offered me coffee. When I stood up to leave, Daniel didn't walk me to the door. Emily didn't look up. I stepped outside into the cool air of that quiet suburban street. Rows of identical houses, trimmed lawns, not a single thing out of place. I stood there for a moment, holding my coat, trying to remember when my son stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as something else, something lesser. I got into my old car, the one Daniel used to beg me to let him drive when he was 16. My hands rested on the wheel longer than necessary. I didn't start the engine right away, because for the first time in a long while, I understood something clearly. What hurt wasn't what she said. It was that my son let her say it. And as I drove away from that house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time they talked about me like that. It was just the first time they said it out loud. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove without thinking, letting the road decide for me. That old highway outside Columbus still looked the same as it did 30 years ago. Same gas stations, same faded billboards, same long stretches where a man can hear his own thoughts whether he wants to or not. And that's when the memories started creeping in. Daniel as a boy, sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out, chewing on the end of a pencil like it held the answers. Back then, he used to look at me like I knew everything, like I could fix anything. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Funny how that changes. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was already dipping low. My house wasn't much. Small, quiet, a little worn around the edges. But it was mine. Every inch of it paid for, every wall holding a piece of my life. I stepped inside and set my keys down on the same wooden table they'd rested on for years. The silence hit me right away. Thick, familiar. No voices, no footsteps. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down. And that's when it started to sink in. This wasn't just about Emily. This was about Daniel. Because a man doesn't wake up one morning and suddenly feel ashamed of where he came from. That kind of thinking. It builds. Quietly. Over time. And I realized something that made my chest tighten. He'd been embarrassed of me for a long while. I just hadn't wanted to see it. A few days passed before I heard from him. Not a call, not even the decency of hearing his voice, just a text message. "You should apologize to Emily. She felt disrespected." I stared at that screen for a long time. Disrespected. I read it again, slower this time, like maybe I'd misunderstood. But I hadn't. I set the phone down carefully, like it might break if I held it too tight. Then I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. So that's what it had come to. Not only was I the embarrassment, I was also the problem. That night I didn't turn on the television, didn't read, didn't do much of anything. I just sat there in the quiet, going over every moment I could remember. Every time I showed up for him, every time I helped, every time I put him first without thinking twice. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet understanding settling into place. I reached for my phone again, opened his message, and for a second, I considered replying. Maybe explaining myself. Maybe smoothing things over like I always had. But my thumb hovered over the screen, and then slowly pulled back, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to fix this, and that thought scared me more than anything else. The next morning, though, things got worse, because that's when Emily called me herself. Her name lit up on my phone like it had every right to be there. Emily. I let it ring longer than I normally would. Long enough for me to notice the hesitation in my own hands. Long enough to realize I wasn't picking up out of habit this time. I answered on the fourth ring. "Hello." There was no greeting on her end. No warmth. Just that same sharp tone she had in the kitchen. "We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "About what?" A short pause, then, "About your behavior." That word again. Behavior. Like I was some child who needed correcting. "I didn't realize I'd done something wrong," I said calmly. She exhaled through her nose, impatient. "Showing up unannounced, bringing groceries like that, making it seem like we can't take care of ourselves. It's inappropriate." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Inappropriate," I repeated quietly. "Yes," she said, firmer now. "And, frankly, it puts Daniel in a difficult position." There it was. Not about me. Not really. About how I made things look. "I brought food," I said. "That's all." "It's not just food," she snapped. "It's what it represents." I let that sit between us. "And what exactly does it represent, Emily?" Another pause. But this one felt different. Like she hadn't expected me to ask that. Finally, she said it. "It makes you look desperate." That one landed. Not loud, not explosive, just deep. I shifted in my chair, my hand tightening slightly around the phone. "Desperate," I repeated. "Yes," she said, softer now, but no kinder. "And Daniel has worked very hard to build a certain life. We don't want that image compromised." I stared at the wall in front of me. At the old photograph hanging there, Daniel at 12 years old, holding a baseball glove too big for his hand, grinning like the world belonged to him. I swallowed. "I see," I said. "Good," she replied quickly. "Then I think an apology would go a long way. For both of us. Both of us." Like we were equals in this conversation, like she had any idea what it took to raise the man she was talking about. I let out a slow breath. "And Daniel agrees with you?" There was a brief hesitation. Just a second. "Yes." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "All right," I said. Her tone softened immediately. "I'm glad we understand each other." But we didn't. Not even close. "Emily," I added before she could hang up. "Yes." I paused. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to make sure I said it right. "I won't be coming by anymore." Silence. Then, a slight shift in her voice. "Well, that's probably for the best." No concern. No attempt to fix it. Just relief. That told me everything I needed to know. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, phone still in my hand, the room quieter than it had ever felt before, because something had changed, not just in them, in me. For years I had adjusted myself, made myself smaller, quieter, easier to tolerate. I told myself it was love, that this is what parents do. But sitting there in that silence, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. Love isn't supposed to feel like humiliation. And for the first time, I started wondering what would happen if I stopped being the man they expected me to be. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I opened the old locked drawer in my study, and inside it was the part of my life my son knew nothing about. Not a single thing. I stood there for a moment, staring down at it, feeling that same quiet stillness in my chest again. Because if things kept going the way they were, he was about to find out, just not in the way he expected. I hadn't opened that drawer in years, not because I forgot about it, but because I chose to. Some things in life, you put away on purpose, not out of shame, just out of a quiet understanding that not everyone needs to know who you really are. I pulled the drawer open slowly, the wood sticking just a little like it always had. Inside, everything was exactly where I left it. Neat, ordered, untouched by time. Old documents, investment statements, property deeds, letters from people who only ever addressed me as Mr. Whitaker, never just Dad. I picked up one of the folders and ran my hand across it. Heavy paper, clean edges, a different life. Daniel had never seen any of this, never asked, and I never offered. I told myself it didn't matter, that what mattered was being present, being supportive, being a father first. So I let him believe what he wanted, that I was just simple, an old man in a modest house, fixed income, careful with money, nothing impressive, nothing to brag about. I let him believe that. I sat down at the desk and opened the folder. Numbers stared back at me. Clean, undeniable numbers. Monthly statements, transfers, accounts tied to names that weren't mine anymore, at least not publicly. I had structured it that way years ago. Quiet streams, separate channels, no noise, no attention. I leaned back in the chair and let out a slow breath. $80,000 a month. Even now, saying it in my own head didn't feel real. And yet, it had been real for a long time. Long before Daniel bought that big house. Long before Emily started talking about image and embarrassment. I closed the folder gently, because the truth wasn't just what I had, it was what I'd been doing with it. My eyes drifted to another stack of papers, smaller, less formal. Receipts, tuition payments, medical bills, mortgage contributions routed through third parties. All of it tied back to one place, Daniel's life. I had never handed him money directly, never made it obvious. I didn't want him to feel like he owed me anything, or worse, depended on me. So I made sure everything just worked. Bills got paid. Opportunities appeared, doors opened quietly, and he never once asked how. I rubbed my thumb along the edge of the desk, a habit I picked up years ago when I needed to think clearly. All this time, he thought he built it alone. And maybe that was my mistake, because somewhere along the way, my silence didn't make him independent. It made him blind. Blind enough to look at his own father and see nothing. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. Same view I'd had for years. Same stillness. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Because now there was a question sitting in my chest that I couldn't ignore. What happens when the man they think is small stops playing small? My phone buzzed behind me, sharp against the silence. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Daniel. I let it ring once, twice. Then I turned slowly, walked back to the desk, and picked it up. This time, I answered. "Dad," he said, his voice tight, controlled. We need to talk. I sat down again, calm, steady. I figured we might. There was a pause on the other end. Then, "The mortgage company called," he said. "They're asking questions about payments, about delays." I didn't say anything, because I knew exactly what he was talking about. "And?" I asked. "And I don't understand what's going on," he snapped. "Things don't just stop like that." "No, they don't, unless someone stops them." I leaned back in my chair, my voice quiet, almost gentle. "Sometimes they do, son." Silence, heavy, confused. Then his tone shifted, sharper now. "Did you have something to do with this?" I looked down at the folder still open on the desk, at the life he never knew existed, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to protect him from the truth, but I wasn't ready to give it to him either. Not yet. "Daniel," I said slowly, "how do you think all those things were getting paid?" Another silence. Longer this time. Unsteady. Because for the first time, he didn't have an answer. And I could hear it in his breathing. That small crack forming. That moment when certainty starts to slip. I don't know," he admitted. I nodded to myself. Of course he didn't, because he had never looked. And now, he was about to start. "Maybe it's time you did," I said quietly. And I hung up before he could ask anything else. He showed up the next morning. No warning this time either. Just a hard knock on my front door, louder than it needed to be. I took my time getting up, walking across the house, letting him stand there with his thoughts for a few extra seconds. When I opened the door, Daniel looked different. Not angry, not confident, unsettled. "Dad," he said quickly, stepping inside before I even invited him. "What's going on?" "The bank called again. They're saying payments haven't been coming through for weeks." "Weeks?" I closed the door behind him, calm as ever. "I know," I said. He turned to face me, confusion turning into something sharper. "You know? What does that mean, you know?" I walked past him into the living room and sat down like this was any ordinary morning, like we were talking about the weather. "It means," I said, folding my hands, "that those payments didn't stop on their own." He stared at me, and then it hit him. Not all at once, but enough. "You're telling me?" he started, his voice tightening. "You had something to do with this." I looked at him properly then. Really looked. My son. The man who thought I was something small. "Yes," I said. The word landed heavy between us. His face changed. First disbelief, then anger. "Why would you do that?" he snapped. "Do you have any idea what this is going to cause? The house, the kids' school, everything depends on that." I nodded slowly. "I'm aware." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing now. "This doesn't make any sense. You don't even have that kind of money. So how—" "That's enough," I said quietly. He stopped, because something in my voice had changed. Not louder, just final. "You've spent years not asking questions, Daniel," I continued. "Years accepting things without wondering where they came from, and now that it's stopped, suddenly you want answers." His jaw tightened. "Because it affects my life." I held his gaze. "It always affected your life." Silence, thick, pressing. He shook his head. No, you're not making sense. You're retired. You live here." He gestured around the modest room like it proved his point. "You don't have money like that." I let that sit for a moment. Then I stood up, walked over to my desk, and picked up the folder. The same one I hadn't touched in years. I placed it on the table in front of him. "Open it." He hesitated. Then slowly, he did. I watched his face as his eyes moved across the pages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something deeper, something almost fragile. "What is this?" he whispered. "Read it." He flipped through faster now. Statements, accounts, transfers, numbers, Big numbers. Monthly deposits, regular payments, his payments. His voice came out thinner than I'd ever heard it. This isn't real. It is. He looked up at me, eyes searching my face like he was trying to find the lie. There's no way, he said. 80,000 a month. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because he could see it. Every page, every number, every quiet truth I had carried for years. You've been paying for all of this? He asked, his voice barely holding together. The house, the car, the school, all of it? Yes. The room went still. I could hear his breathing now, uneven, shallow. But why wouldn't you tell me? He said. That question, that one almost made me smile. Because I didn't want a son who depended on me, I said. I wanted a son who stood on his own. He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. This isn't standing on my own. This is a lie. No, I said calmly. This is the truth you never bothered to look for. He stepped back like the floor shifted under him. All this time, he muttered. All this time, I thought. I know what you thought, I said. That shut him up. Because we both knew. He swallowed hard. Emily, she... Yes, I interrupted gently. She's ashamed of my poor background. His face flushed instantly, and for the first time since he walked in, he didn't have anything to say. Not a defense, not an excuse, nothing. I stepped closer, my voice steady, not cruel, just honest. You built your life, Daniel, I said, but you built it on something you didn't even recognize. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. So what now? He asked, his voice low. You just cut everything off? Ruin us to prove a point? I looked at him for a long moment. Then I shook my head slowly. This isn't about ruining you. I paused, because this was the part that mattered. This is about finally letting you see who you really are, without me holding you up. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in his life, they weren't full of certainty. They were full of fear. And right then, his phone started ringing. He looked down at the screen like it might bite him. Emily. Of course it was. He hesitated, just for a second, then answered. What? He snapped, already on edge. I watched his face as he listened. The color drained slowly, like someone pulling the life out of him one word at a time. What do you mean they called? He said, pacing now. No, that's not possible. There has to be some mistake. A pause. Longer this time. Then his voice dropped. Lower. Tighter. They what? He stopped moving. Completely still. I could hear her voice faintly through the phone. Sharp, panicked, nothing like the composed woman who stood in that kitchen days before. Daniel closed his eyes. No, don't say anything to them yet, he muttered. I'll handle it. Just don't. He stopped, swallowing hard. I said I'll handle it. He pulled the phone away slowly and ended the call. The silence that followed was different. Not heavy, not tense, just empty. He stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. Then he looked at me, and I saw it. Not anger, not pride. Something smaller than both. They're pulling the school contract, he said quietly. Late payments. I didn't respond. They said if it's not resolved by the end of the week. His voice trailed off. I nodded once. He let out a breath that didn't quite make it all the way out. And the mortgage, he added, almost to himself. If I don't fix that. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. We both knew. For the first time since he walked into that house of his. Since he stood in that kitchen and said nothing while his wife looked down on me. He looked like a man standing without support. No safety net. No quiet hand catching what he dropped. Just himself. He ran both hands through his hair, pacing again. Slower now. I can figure this out, he muttered. I just need time. His voice cracked slightly. and he stopped talking altogether. I watched him, really watched him. Not as the man he became, but as the boy he used to be. And I said nothing. Because this part wasn't mine to fix. He turned toward the door suddenly, like he couldn't stand being in that room another second. "I have to go," he said quickly. "I need to make calls. I need to—" He stopped, looked at me, like he wanted to say something else. Like maybe there was still a part of him reaching for me. But he didn't. He just nodded once, short, stiff, and walked out. The door closed behind him harder than it needed to, and just like that, he was gone. I stood there in the quiet of my house, the same quiet that had been there for years. Only now it felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just honest. I walked back to the window and looked out at the street. Same road, same stillness. But somewhere out there, my son was learning something he had never had to learn before. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't follow. I didn't step in. I just stood there, listening to the silence settle around me again, until even that felt like too much. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.